Can the Gunners bounce back from their Wembley defeat in the League Cup when it comes to FA Cup matters? Tolu, welcome as always. Arsenal back in action. It's the FA Cup, but they go to Southampton at the weekend in one of 4 quarter-finals. Premier League leaders, League Cup losers. So what can they do in the FA Cup this weekend?
That's a good one. Premier League leaders, League Cup losers. Look, the international break has been, I don't know how it's been for Arsenal. I don't think whether you can classify it as a successful international break or otherwise. There was a lot of talk in the media about just how many Arsenal players pulled out of international duty. I think Bukayo Saka and Declan Rice reported for England duty, but didn't play any games because he said they were carrying knocks that they weren't. The England manager wasn't willing to risk any of them. So I think we've gotten to that part of the season where Mikel Arteta is going to keep his cards very close to his chest. I think he did that a lot last season, where you almost went to his pre-match press conference and he really didn't give anything away as far as player fitness was concerned. He basically tells you a player is 50-50 and he starts the game. Sometimes he tells you player isn't fit enough and then you see him start the game. So there's a bit of concern around who's fit and who's not. Martin Odegaard, we hear, could make the bench. There's Timber also in there. I think if this was a normal championship team who are maybe struggling at the moment, maybe Arsenal could afford to maybe change a lot, especially as you know they've got Champions League commitments in midweek. But that's not the case. Southampton are in really good form. They're one of the form teams of the championship, and Arsenal cannot go to St Mary's and expect us to show up and win the game. So it'll be interesting to see who's fit and who's not really. As out, as we hear, we choose to believe that. Like I said, Timber and Martin Odegaard are rumored to be maybe close to the returning. But I think the strength in depth that Arsenal have is now being tested. I saw Pierre Nkapie limp off while playing for his national team during the international break. So that's another concern for them. So it's really about the team that Arsenal put out against Southampton. I don't think this is the kind of game where they go and not put out a decent team. I don't think this is the kind of game where you rest maybe 8 to 10 players for. I think Southampton are way, way more dangerous than that. And look, immediately after losing the Carabao Cup final, they didn't have any games to bounce back and really show that they were back on the horse. So they've allowed the pain to fester for a long, long time. And I don't think Arsenal fans will appreciate if they go maybe a little weak against Southampton. But it remains to be seen, like I said, who's really fit and who's not.
Well, you mentioned the Arsenal international withdrawals. 11 players across the squads were called back to Arsenal. Now, there's always a club versus country row, especially at this point of the season, because clubs such as Arsenal are looking for bigger prizes. So when you consider Mikel Arteta, how much gamesmanship do you reckon has been involved in calling these players back? Is that his right to do so in terms of protecting his stars for what he needs to do rather than what international managers need to do? Because if, say, 8 or 9 of those 11 injuries all return at the weekend, you think something's a little suspect here. So what do you reckon, or what do you make of this whole international callback, I wouldn't say scandal, but intrigue in terms of Arsenal? Are they right or are they wrong?
Look, if you look at the moral high ground, people will tell you the clubs pay the players' wages. They're the ones who, the players, basically, they earn their livelihoods at the clubs. And playing for their countries is literally down to prestige. But then again, in footballing terms, every player wants to play for their country. And I think the common sense here is, if you're an international player and you do play for Arsenal, I think you probably have one foot in your national team anyway, to be honest. And look, at the end of the day, you look at the England manager, for instance, Thomas Tuchel, he's been a club manager, so he understands how this works. Look, what does he want to gain if he plays Bukayo Saka and Declan Rice? And the truth is, at this point in the season, I used to be friends with an ex-footballer, Andre Piqué, who used to play for Burnley back in the day. And he said that, look, when it gets to this point of the season, no player is 100%. He says players are always carrying knocks. And because the World Cup is so close, when you have really important players, you really, as a national team manager, and you're sure they're going to play for you at the World Cup, you really don't want to take any. If they have a chance to get a rest, you obviously will give them the rest. So I think, yes, there has been some gamesmanship for sure. I think Mikel Arteta is a king of that. I think he's probably whispered a bit into the national team managers' ears and says, look, these guys aren't 100%. it's not like you're going to qualify. You're playing any meaningful games, usually friendlies, or you just leave them out and let them get the extra rest. And I think probably makes sense if you're an Arsenal supporter, but if you support the rival, it looks like it's gamesmanship. So it's 6.5, it's 6.5 a dozen. But I think you have to find the right balance. I don't think Erling Haaland didn't play for Manchester City in this international window. Also, he was rested, and I didn't hear anyone speak about that happening. So I think for Arsenal and for Arteta, obviously, he said something to those national team managers. You're very sure he's done that. But I think common sense also, most of those guys will get into your national teams at the World Cup anyway. So I don't think it's something you should lose sleep about.
And if you're Mikel Arteta, what do you do about the goalkeeper? Because obviously much was made in the build-up to the League Cup final as to who would start. Kepa given the nod. Kepa didn't really make a good account of himself at Wembley. So would you give him a second chance, or would you go for your strongest in terms of David Raya at the weekend?
I really didn't get the noise about the goalkeeper. I think everyone knows that some of the bigger clubs really prioritize because look, if you have a second goalkeeper, you don't want him to sit on the bench all season long, because when you do need him, you want him to have a bit of match practice. And how do you give him match practice? You give him the cup games. City played James Trafford in goal in the FA Cup and the Carabao Cup final. If he made an error, that also would have been set. Now, though, is where it's tricky. Because, look, if Arsenal had lost fair and square and Kepa hadn't been responsible for any of the goals they conceded, no one really have said, why did they start him? I think he'll start against Southampton. It depends on how Arteta looks at it. Arsenal's season could go really, really bad, and the pressure could crank up if they somehow manage not to win at Southampton, which is something that can happen. This Southampton team have lost since January. I think they're on a 14-match unbeaten run and won 11 of those games. So I think at home, they're beaten like 11 games at home. Last time they lost was in January. So Arsenal aren't going to play the normal run-of-the-mill championship team. They knocked out Fulham in the previous round of the FA Cup. So Arsenal do know that they're a dangerous side. I think if I was going to pick a goalkeeper, I personally would go with my strongest goalkeeper in Raya. But at the end of the day, you do not want to destroy the confidence of your second goalkeeper. What happens if Raya starts the game, gets injured, misses the rest of the season? You'll have to go back to Kepa.
Well, you just mentioned that Southampton knocked out Premier League opposition in Fulham in the previous round. Can they do the same against Arsenal in the quarterfinals? Tolu, with your betting cap on, which way does this one go?
Oof, that's a difficult question. I'm not very confident, to be honest. I've seen Arsenal away from home in the FA Cup, especially against lower league opposition. And yes, they've done enough to win the games. But look, we've gotten to the business end of the season, and I really don't know how they'll rebound after that Carabao Cup final loss, because you could see that it really, really did hurt them. So I think I'll probably just try to stay safe here. I think I saw the stat that Arsenal got 52 corners in their last 5 matches. So that tells you that they average over 10.5 corners every game. So I think I'll probably go corners. It's got a good value. And because Arsenal haven't particularly been keeping clean sheets, and with all the noise around the defensive injuries that they've got at the moment, I probably would go both teams to score. So I'd go both teams to score. And if you want something of more value, I'd go over 10.5 corners.
Well, keep an eye on the corner count at St Mary's. I'll keep an eye on the goals. It sounds a good one, Tolu. Thanks as always. I'll see you next week.
You're welcome.